very strange name for a run-and-gun game from 1988 by Williams Electronics, and it certainly isn't a game named after your ex who enjoys turning your own family against you or anything like that. Narc is one of those most earliest examples of using extreme violence in a game that caused panic amongst parents back in the day. The premise of the game is to take down an underground network of drug traffickers and terrorists as ordered from the narcotics chairman at Washington DC. It is originally a 2-player simultaneous game where we get to play as either Max Force or the Hitman. Throughout the game we get to take down drug users and kingpins, we can shoot them or arrest them. There is plenty of pixelated gore and limbs flying everywhere with this game, especially when using rocket launchers to blow up gangs of enemies. Like I say, a fairly extreme game for a 1988 release, so forget Grand Theft Auto or even Doom, this game did all that first. It's a seriously fun game to play and an early example of using digitized images to give sprites that in-game realism look. I don't think it can be argued, but for a 1988 release, Narc looks incredibly sharp and detailed for its time. If you remember the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film, Narc was actually being played in the background of the Foot Clan's Hangout arcade. I will note here that the 2005 releases of Narc on both the original Xbox and PlayStation 2 will not be here, as these are totally different games and also sequels. And we are ranking which original home conversions was the next best thing to the 1988 arcade game itself. I'm also going to say here that all conversions minus one are fairly bad and laughable.
You're busted.
For kids loading the Amstrad CPC's conversion back in 1990, you likely would have enjoyed the opening presentation and fairly decent 8-bit music for the game. Sadly, most people playing the game for the Amstrad CPC at the time likely would have presumed that loading went wrong when there was no in-game sound. If this annoyed you more, then the blocky sprites likely would have calmed you down, and that very slow-paced scrolling action too. As I was playing this version, I actually thought better than to fire a missile, as a poor thing was struggling enough as it was, and I simply didn't want to overload things even further. Some people might moan about Amstrad CPC games getting the worst conversions. I'd say look at it for what it is and not out of nostalgia. This really is a terrible conversion of Narc. It's not entertaining, it's slow, depressing, and overly really bad to control. The ZX Spectrum 128K received a conversion from Ocean in 1990. Now, because playing Narc had several actions that were a little different to simulate on a standard one action button joystick, we had to use the keyboard to make some of the actions work alongside the joystick, which was a common theme with particular games on the micros. For example, we had to use spacebar to make our character jump, which is a real pain. In order to fire missiles, you held onto the fire button for a couple of seconds and let go for this to take effect. So as for the gameplay itself, we get an introduction for missions where we see who the enemy is, and it looks fairly good here. The presentation looks fairly faithful given its limitations. We don't arrive at stages by car, we are just plopped onto the stage and the action starts. There is no in-game music, just rudimentary sound effects which aren't that bad to be honest. In terms of frame rates, it does certainly slow down a fair amount on the old specky when a lot happens at once. And to be fair, the original game had a lot happening, but it wasn't being powered by a ZX Spectrum of course. Likely it was just a case of cutting down in-game action and taking away sprites, which would actually have made the game fairly boring to play, or just add lots and kids would just have to deal with it. Colour wise, we had the typical Spectrum monochrome look, but if you're a Spectrum fan, this would have meant nothing to you anyways. The gameplay is what matters, and the gameplay here is actually pretty good regardless of slowdowns. Out of all 8-bit computers that Narc was released on, I was kind of hoping at this point at least the Commodore 64 could do the best job. Sure, out of Amstrad and Spectrum's attempts, this was slightly better in that we have in-game music, which sounds pretty good here, and we have a decent and consistent speed that the game is running at. But really, that is where I will stop the highlights of the Ocean 1990 release for the C64. The sprites themselves look ridiculously chunky and very dull in colour too. Enemies in particular stand out big time. It's almost reminded me of that awful Shadow Warrior C64 version, which I previously covered in this series in terms of enemy sprites looking so bad, to the point where they look really stretched. The game hasn't got parallax scrolling, with city buildings in the background having another layer to simulate that 3D effect like the arcade game. I'd say that game is below average at best. The gameplay itself plays fairly well, it is smooth and our character moves nicely. One thing that didn't particularly look good was launching missiles. There wasn't much emphasis on exploding limbs. In fact, it was reduced to mainly a few explosion sprites to cover up the exploding limbs. Although oddly enough, attention was given to bullets having shadows as they shoot across the screen. If you thought the sprites themselves were over pixelated here, the helicopter which flies through stage 2 and your car in stage 3 was just too much to handle. Like I say, out of all 3 8-bit home conversions for microcomputers, I'd say this was the best option, but by no means does it look good. It is purely based on how well this version ran in comparison with the other 2 computer versions. Now, I was expecting the Atari ST conversion to be fairly good. What I didn't expect was to have Narc looking so dark. I have watched many video gameplays of this version, and it really was a case of either adjusting the brightness on your screen, or this is what we get, a dark gameplay screen where it can be difficult to see what is going on. It's a great shame as the gameplay itself and different sprites used for walking upwards and downwards are actually here. The HUD's layout is also very similar to the arcades game, and the sound effects are pretty good here too, although there isn't any background music in game. The opening music is very good here though. It is missing the iconic stage openings with the speeding car entering into the stages. I got to say that out of most versions of Narc, the ST version is particularly difficult. Just like I was hoping that Commodore 64 would have a really good version for the 8-bit computer versions, I was hoping the same for Amiga, but all I can say is that this is pretty much the same as the Atari ST conversion, only slightly faster with frame rates and more brightly coloured, although this is no doubt a dark game for the Amiga too. The Amiga in ST ports had something in common, those damn dogs who chase after you and having to click the joystick down twice very quickly to duck and shoot them. It's very annoying. Again, this version opens up with the same music as ST's port, just a slight upgrade, and like I say, generally the same game. It could have been so much better for the Amiga, but this is what Ocean gave us in this 1990 release. No cool arrival to stages by car, and incredibly and unnecessarily difficult to play from the get-go. And in first place, the Nintendo Entertainment System had a version of Narc, which is very strange for the NES considering the theme and storyline of the game itself. You know what, this isn't a bad port at all. Sprites, including the car, all look fairly good here, even if they kind of do look a little scaled down in size. We also have a separate sprite for when our character is walking up and down so we can see the front and back of him, like the arcade game. We have both in-game music as well as sound effects, which all sounds very good too. I wasn't expecting to see bags of white stuff, or certainly enemies' limbs flying everywhere as I launch missiles at them. In terms of colour, looks very good to me. Obviously, we don't have the whole digitized imagery, which made the arcades game look so good in its day. After all, this is an 8-bit console, which happens to do everything fairly well. We have alternative text being displayed on shops which aren't so blatant with the rawness of the arcade original. We even have the helicopter here in Stage 2, which opens fire on you and drop bombs on you. Acclaim released this version in 1990. It scrolls nicely and is really nice to control too. Out of most versions, I didn't honestly expect the NES version to be this good, but it really was. What also makes this version a little better is that, of course, we had 2 action buttons on the Nintendo NES controller, and so the need of using a keyboard for certain actions wasn't needed here. So that's it. I did warn you at the get-go of this video today that there was some horrendous versions of Narc for your home computers, and oddly enough, the NES version just seemed to be that much better. So which version did you have? Was you very disappointed that your Atari ST's version was so dark? Which version did you play? And most importantly, do you remember playing this in the arcade? What a fantastic game. Anyways, if you're new to the channel and you want to catch up with my arcade ports ranking series, I'll leave the playlist in the description so you can watch over 50 videos at this point. Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching.